Good afternoon. Thank you for joining. This is Michelle Savage with XBRL US, and you are here for our webinar, Standards for Regulators, Building the Data Model. We're very happy to have with us today three speakers. Rob Hudson is Energy Industry Analyst at the at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission at the FERC. We have Joe Lechka. Joe is Director at KPMG. And Scott Tice, who is President and CEO of NovaWorks. Scott is also the Chair of the XBRL US Domain Steering Committee. Before we get started today, I just want to run through a few logistical points. You can send us questions by clicking on the Q&A link at the top of your console and just key your question in, and we'll be sure to cover those during the course of the presentation. We also will be showing videos of our speakers as they come up. And you'll be able to move the video console to the right-hand or left-hand side of your screen or down on the bottom if you'd prefer, so that it doesn't cover up the slides. Everyone will be on mute with the exception of our presenters. And I also want to mention that we are offering CPE credit for today's session. So for those of you who have already asked to get CPE or who would like to get it and haven't yet asked, make sure that you respond to the questions that we take at a couple of different points during the session today. So with that, I'm going to move to our next slide and talk a little bit about the agenda that we'll be covering. First, we're going to start off by doing a review of the taxonomy and the XBRL report. And this builds on the session that we did about a month ago, where we featured Jarrett Klokota from Ernst & Young and Mark Montoya from FDIC. You can come back and listen to that replay if you'd like to. It's in the archives on our event page. So Scott Tice is going to be taking us through this review, and then we're going to go straight into defining the data model. Joe Lechka will cover scope, objectives, and policies, defining requirements, and throughout he's going to be providing kind of little case studies featuring the SEC, the FDIC, but most importantly the FERC. And we'll have a discussion with Rob Hudson at the FERC as Joe takes you through defining the data model. So with that, I'm going to move to our next slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Scott Tice.
Thank you, Michelle. First, thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak to today about the Taxonomy Development Handbook and overall taxonomy development for XBRL. I think XBRL provides an excellent platform for being able to define long-standing data models that that will stand the test of time 10, 15 years after documents have been made. And the other thing that separates XBRL from so many other formats is that it brings with it a data model that you can define and have a lot of flexibility in doing that. And we'll be talking about that more today as we go on. So the primary goal of what we did here with the Taxonomy Development Handbook was to basically give a guidance on how to organize your data, what the components are of XBRL, how to build taxonomies, how to implement them, and how to maintain them. And it includes case studies, it includes a lot of real world information, and a lot of templates. Next slide, please. So that can be found at xbrl.us/xbrl-reference/tdh/ and you'll see the page that you have on the right here. We also have templates that are available. And if you go to the website, that link is there as well, but it's xbrl.us/tdh templates. Those include things like a white paper, an overview of XBRL, so you don't have to invent writing in what I call the elevator ride description of something. It's basically actually a little bit longer than it's about a page or two. A taxonomy guide and a preparer's guide and a consumer guide template. And that really helps frame things out so you're not starting off with a blank whiteboard saying, hey, how am I going to actually tell people about the taxonomy that we developed? The information is also available on GitHub. So that's another place that you can go to. And as revisions come up, we'll be adding those over time. So next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about what a taxonomy is, and then Joe will go in and actually show how we go through the process of defining a data model. So a taxonomy is similar to what you think of as just from the biological standpoint. You have a taxonomy of species that breaks out as a very large tree where things are organized. The same thing's true here, but we're talking about a data model. It's a hierarchical setup where we have different entry points that describe different submodels that can be part of the data representation. It doesn't necessarily have to be financial information. If you look at GAAP and other things, it's mostly financial information, but it can be a lot of other things as well. And you have an opportunity to create what are called concepts. And the concepts then have certain attributes associated with them. And that in turn can be used to help restrict and define the data, including, as you see on the right here, we're kind of looking at what's essentially a screenshot from Yeti showing a particular concept. You'll see all the things that are associated with it, such as the documentation, the different roles it can have, the data types, for example, whether or not it's monetary or text or non-numeric or a date. You can go through and have used standard data types to basically make sure that users or preparers are putting the right type of data in. And as well, we have all the references and authority as to where these things came from. And that's one of the things that really helps, I think, in terms of the organizational staying power of XBRL data. That when you take the instance data, the actual data that you're producing, combine it with the taxonomy, you have a lot of long-standing information that can be used and compared with other filers. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we look at here is basically, what is in each concept. Basically, it's able to represent those data types. And there's actually a thing called a data type registry. Over the past number of years, or decades actually, there's been established an actual registry of all kinds of data types. They start with the fundamentals, the simplest things you can think of as an integer or a non-zero integer or a negative integer, floating point, percent, strings, and a numerator list and things like that, and go all the way up to, say, different types of energy, different types of volume. So there's lots and lots of different types of data types. Certain data types also let you define units, such as if you're doing currency, you can say, this is in Canadian dollars, and be able to have a fact represented in multiple ways in the instance. Also, as part of the overall taxonomy, it has information with, first, the hierarchy. In other words, what belongs with what. It can specify calculations of what should equal what else. That helps basically deal with validation. So you're validating not only the kind of data, but then how it relates to other data. Plus you have a definition and references that are authoritative as to where it came from. And you can use different types of labels. For those of you that might be familiar with UGT, labels are kind of not standard for the most part. They're whatever the preparer has, but labels can also be fixed. And if you have a closed taxonomy, you're required to use one of the selected label roles. So in that case, that helps narrow things down a little bit if it's possible to do that. Next slide, please. So when we take the taxonomy that is describing the data structure, the model, and of course it can be very complicated, and I'm sorry for those of you who forget to turn their cell phone off during a presentation, forgive me. You'll see in certain taxonomies, it can be very comprehensive. I hate to keep going back to GAAP, but there's like 17,000 plus concepts there, and they're not all sitting on one entry point. They're all well organized and laid out depending on the kind of data that is being presented. Depending on what you might need to do, whether you're taking an existing system and applying XBRL to it, or developing a new one, you may have very simple data sets, or you may have very complex data sets. And XBRL gives you that opportunity to structure it any way that you need. When you actually create data to submit to a regulatory agency, or perhaps disclose to the public, or maybe it's being used between different business entities, and as is the case in certain things where it's totally private, what you're doing is you're creating an instance document or a report. And that report simply says, hey, this particular fact or value, a number or some text, is represented by this concept, and then what will intersect that with a period, and then perhaps dimensional members. And those dimensional members can be very sophisticated if need be. So in the instance document all by itself, all you really have is the concept, the fact data, and then whatever contexts that are intersecting, or whatever dimensions are intersecting. And that instance data can then be in XML, which has been kind of the traditional thing. It can be an inline XBRL, which allows you to put the XBRL in with HTML. That makes the presentation aspect of it very controllable for the preparers, or it can be in things like JSON or CSV. CSV may seem real simple, being a comma delimited thing, but it's very good at representing large swaths of data where I have to say have 100,000 entries of the same kind of data over and over and over again in rows. Next slide, please. So why don't we go ahead at this point and move on to the CPE questions, and I'll turn it back over to Michelle to get that going. And then after that, Joe will take over.
Thanks very much. So the first question that we have for those of you getting CPE credit, and Scott, if you could let me know if you don't see this, you should be able to see this, but the first question is, an XBRL taxonomy is most accurately defined as doing which of the following? And just click on, is it number 1, digitally represents data needed to be reported? Number 2, represents the relationship between concepts? Number 3, represents many different data types, including monetary, string, percent, or enumerated lists? Or is it all of the above? So just click on the answer that you think is appropriate. And we'll give it about another 15 seconds. Okay, just about another 5 seconds here. Okay, I'm going to be shutting down this poll, and we'll take our second poll question. And just so you know the answer to that one, the answer is all of the above. So I'm going to go to poll number 2. Okay, and for this question, the XBRL taxonomy and XBRL instance each contain information that help report facts. Which of the following are only contained in the taxonomy? Is it number 1, the relationship between concepts? Number 2, data types, for example, that it's monetary, string, or integer? Number 3, document-specific information, for example, reporting entity, report time period? Or number 4, authoritative references, for example, that it's a FASB or perhaps a GASB reference. So the question again is, which of the following is only contained in the taxonomy? Okay, we're going to bring the poll to a close here. All right. And thank you again for answering that question. And we're going to move on to our next part of the program, defining the data model. And Joe Luchka, Joe, thanks for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Scott, for kicking us off. And thank you to all of our participants today for taking time out of your schedule to join us. In this next section, we're going to cover some new material about how regulators go about defining the data model. As we cover each topic, we'll review the approach taken by the SEC and the public company reporting. We'll go through some FDIC for bank reporting comments. Then we'll turn to our guest speaker, Rob Hudson, for his thoughts on how the FERC made some of these decisions. Moving on to the next slide. So, defining the scope is the first step in initiating the project. What data needs to be reported? Where is that data reported today? Who creates, processes, and uses the data? All stakeholders will need to be involved, or the standard program will not meet the needs of the supply chain. Is the data created today in documents? Is it in reports? Is it loaded into databases? Is it prepared in a single report or in multiple reports? What's the current data collection infrastructure, or is there one? What problems or data standards are expected to solve? What resources are available to build the standards, support the implementation, the post-implementation, and manage the taxonomy going forward? This is one of the things I tend to focus on, is building something that's sustainable to manage the process going forward. Consider these issues up front allows regulators to establish a reporting infrastructure that can adapt to changes in the reporting requirements and changes in technologies over time. Building data standards is a long-term solution that should be defined to benefit the reporting ecosystem for the long term. Moving on to the next slide. Let's talk about some objectives and some policies. Every taxonomy is put in place to meet certain objectives, and it requires policies that support those objectives. Some common goals are to reduce costs, increase timeliness, consistency, and data quality. Standards may be designed to satisfy regulatory requirements or meet industry demands. The objectives in the current reporting structure may dictate policies that you put in place. For example, you may be working within a reporting framework that follows a codified standard, or one that is simply based on existing reporting processes. The data that will be reported may be made publicly available or privately collected by the regulator. There may be a finite set of data fields that can be reported, or some entities may need to report information that is unique. This will lead to a policy on the use of custom extensions. If you need some level of flexibility, but wish to preclude the use of extensions, you can take a different approach. The SEC, for example, does allow extensions, but the FERC does not, even though there is some flexibility built into the FERC taxonomy that will allow for utility-specific content. We're going to go over a little bit of that with Rob later. Regulators should consider each step on the reporting supply chain, from data preparation and intake to how the data will be made available and how users will extract and consume it. How will the standards implementation impact each actor in the process, the preparer, the regulator, the user? Will some preparers find implementation more challenging than others? Factors such as these will help in setting policies on how the program is rolled out. Moving on to the next slide, let's look at an example related to FDIC reporting. The FDIC is the first case study on setting policies that we'll talk about today. The FDIC established the first large XBRL project in the United States in 2005. Banks are required to report financial information to the FDIC on standardized forms called call reports. This information must be filed no later than 30 days after the end of the quarter, contains financial data including the bank's income statement, balance sheet, and other data relevant to the bank's financial health. Financial analysts review call reports for errors and any other audit-related issues. Call report data is used by bank regulatory agencies to monitor banking activities, and it is also used by the public, Congress, state banking authorities, researchers, rating agencies, investors, and academia. The FDIC maintains a call report database. Call reports, as shown here on the screen, in the little screenshot, are highly structured with required data that is well defined. Since 1998, banks have had to submit call report data electronically to the FDIC call agencies. All banks are required to purchase one of 9 approved vendor software packages to prepare their call report data. When the FDIC established the program, they relied on the existing, clearly defined call report standards to build the taxonomy. Because of the highly structured nature of the call reports, they did not allow banks to create extension elements. Data is made publicly available through bulk downloads or as individual XBRL files. Because the banks were able to rely heavily on the approved software vendors, the transition for banks was relatively easy, and all banks transitioned at the same time. The FDIC started the process by requiring conventional XBRL, and now they have begun using inline XBRL as well, because it is helpful for their analysts to review their submissions in this format. The FDIC has continued to expand on the taxonomy and identify other use cases through the support and ongoing maintenance of the taxonomy. In fact, as you may have heard during the last webinar, the FDIC was able to implement the new CARES Act requirements quickly and efficiently because they had an existing standards program in place. Let's go to the next example, which has to do with SEC reporting. In 2007, the SEC mandated XBRL for public company reporting. What you see on the screen is a snapshot of the income statement portion of the US GAAP taxonomy. The nature of generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP, reporting required that a flexible and more complex set of data standards and implementation program be created. Data is published as individual filings, data downloads, or as an RSS feed. Because of the variation between types of filers and their financials, the taxonomy was structured into industry-specific entry points to make it easier for preparers to identify the concepts that they needed to prepare their financials. While most commercial and industrial company financials are relatively consistent, certain industries have more unique reporting needs. For example, real estate investment trusts, which are highlighted here, are so unique that they have their own statement of income section within the taxonomy. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to drill down into the taxonomy and see one of the elements. And here you can see an element for employee-related liabilities, non-current. Reporting companies can include line items on their financial statement that may be unique to their reporting situation. As in this example, where Levi Strauss reported employee-related liabilities non-current. The SEC therefore allows companies to create custom extensions. Extensions have pros and cons. While they allow for greater flexibility, they make the data produced less comparable from company to company. The program for the SEC phased in requirements for operating companies based on size because they were concerned over resource issues among smaller reporting companies. Initially, companies were required to report using conventional XBRL, but recently the SEC transitioned to inline XBRL, which is a newer XBRL technical specification introduced in 2011. Inline XBRL is a format that combines the human readability of HTML with the machine readability of XBRL. The example we're showing here is inline XBRL, where the facts that have red highlight around them indicate that they have an embedded XBRL tag. Now, moving to the next slide, we're going to ask Rob to join us. And we're going to go through some questions about how the FERC has implemented some of these objectives and some of these concerns. So Rob, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you, Joe?
Fantastic. So let's talk about what was FERC's role in collecting data? What kind of data is collected? Is it publicly available? And who uses that today?
Sure thing. First, I have to say that my views and opinions are my own, and I don't speak for the commission or the commissioners in this way, but we're going to be talking about some really easy facts. It's just a standard disclaimer we all have to do before we join a call. So FERC's a regulator essentially of the interstate commerce of energy and energy products. We have dozens of data collections, and specifically we have upgraded a group of forms that we lump together called e-forms, for lack of a better name, that have been on an old Visual FoxPro collection system that has, if anyone out there in the participants list is nodding and knowing how old this is, really needed to be upgraded. So we collect these forms, most of the forms, Form 1, Form 2, Form 6, are financial forms for the energy industries. Form 1 is for electricity industry, Form 2 for natural gas, and Form 6 is for oil pipeline industries. And Form 60 is a service company form for large companies that set up a sub-company to provide services to them. There's another form in there, 714, which is time series data based on balancing authorities, which may be a little bit out of scope for what we're talking about today. But so we collect this data and we make it available to the public. These are the financials for these energy companies, gas companies, oil companies, and electricity companies in FERC's accounting format. We don't follow US GAAP. FERC has its own accounting and its own accounting rules. It also contains the operations data that is relevant for for the commission to analyze tariffs and decide if rates are just and reasonable. So all of this information is important for FERC, and we collect it quarterly and annually, and both for major and non-major companies. And even non-major companies are large companies.
Great. So the FERC, you considered standards and you incorporated that into your process. What led you to do this? What led you to make it part of your data collection process?
So about 5 or 6 years ago, the commission passed an order wanting to upgrade these collections to an XML format. And we started doing research, and I was put on the project about how best to do this. And in the past, FERC had only done custom XML collections, and we had to answer all the questions about the data ourselves, which is not impossible to do, but it just takes a long time. To write, is a liability in this account always reported as a negative or a positive? Is it, those type of things when you're designing a form are necessary to do because you want the data to come in accurately. You don't want negatives to be reported as positives and things like that. So we got a little bit further down the road and we started pursuing other options that build on an XML format. And XBRL presented an interesting opportunity for the program offices, the offices, not the IT side, that would regulate getting this data in and making sure it was, ingested into our systems, but for people like me to be able to control how the taxonomy is built in a program that resides on my laptop computer and be able to affect the form, the data categories, the elements, and everything about it, write our own rules, even how it's presented when it's created into a PDF or an HTML document. These are actually processed in inline HTML is how we display them. We just don't provide an inline renderer to actually open them in on our eLibrary website currently. That was really important because it cuts out a whole lot of time for us to make changes to these forms. We had, over the years, these forms have been, Form 1 has been collected for about 70 years. And we don't have data going back that far, but it was important for us to do because over the years, because Visual Foxborough was such a problematic, or it just didn't have all the options we wanted to. A lot of additional instructions had been put into the instructions and adding footnotes. So we wanted to incorporate those back into the collection, back into the fields, so people could report a number as opposed to a footnote, like how much of this is blue energy is just an example I give, what percentage, which is just a number. It should be a field, but in the past that's been difficult to add, or it would take a heavy lift for an already strapped IT department who is maintaining all the other FERC systems to add one small field to a collection. So those were the reasons why we decided to do this in a standard way using XBRL, was because and of course all the other outside reasons where people could easily connect to this system, easily develop their programs to it. They understood the standard. It's been proven to work in other places, and many of them already were filing in other, specifically with the SEC and XBRL there.
Great. So actually that was going to lead into my next question, which is, switching from your original plan to build a custom XML to XBRL, but I think you just kind of touched on some of those topics there. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, our system is you mentioned earlier how our system is a little bit closed and a little bit open with extended taxonomies and things like that. And I think we're going to get into that a little bit later. We chose a middle of the road path to develop our XBRL system, and we're very excited about it. It's currently up right now, and we'll share with you a little bit later, but I don't think there's much more about the decision process switching XML to XBRL, except down the line, it saves a lot of time internally and externally when adopting new changes to the program. We've made every single one of our files. Obviously, the taxonomy is open to the public for them to view, but we are putting our rendering code out there, we're putting our validation code out there, and we're putting all the plugins that we have used and modified also out there, so people can, vendors or companies can create a system that is exactly like our system to create, render, manipulate, or do anything with data, with their data before it gets to us, or incorporate other people's data into their workflows.
Great. If we can move forward to the next slide, we actually have a screenshot of one of your forms, your comparative balance sheet under the FERC reporting. And as you were just talking about some of the policy decisions, and this seems to be fairly well structured and would have been an easy thing to convert to XBRL.
When we say easy, on the scale of easy, I guess it is a structured form. This number goes in this spot at all times, and in that respect, it definitely is easy. We have our mandate was to upgrade the current VFP system without making any substantive changes to the data that it collects. So we didn't add any fields. We didn't entertain any policy discussions on how this number was derived or anything like that. We were literally only upgrading our old system to our new one. So that was the basic policy decision. And in that frame allowed us a lot of flexibility to create an XBRL system to collect this data that is both flexible and also very standard for each one of these pages. This is a very standard page. This is one of the easier pages. We have pages, it's about a 70, 75 page form, but submissions, if you were to print them out, would be up to 400 sheets of paper. So it is quite a large undertaking sometimes for these companies to submit this information. And this form right here, you see that there's no blank lines. Some of these pages are just blank cells, blank pages to fill out. And in the past, companies have been able to fill in like a VFP, Visual Fox Pro is like a fillable PDF. So they were able to decide how many lines they needed to skip to create their own formatting with how they sent it in. Other pages within this form had that type of problem. And I don't know, are we going to talk a little bit more about that as we go on?
We are. We're going to come back to that. I've got a couple slides to talk about a bit more about developing the data model and defining the requirements, and then we'll bring you back for some more question and answers.
That sounds great, Joe. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, fantastic. If we can move on to the next slide, we're going to talk about defining requirements. We're going to talk a little bit about defining reporting requirements, and if we can move to slide 22. Let's start off with the functional requirements. As we start to talk about this, let's specify the functional requirements, specify the operations of the data reporting and the collection system, and may include technical details, may include some data manipulation and processing, calculations, and modeling. XBRL taxonomies are meant to transport the data from preparers to consumers. We actually have a chapter in the Taxonomy Development Handbook all about transporting the data. The purpose of the transport may be to enable comparison among multiple reporting entities. It could be to adhere to regulatory guidelines, or to organize the data to meet the needs of certain types of analytical systems. Taxonomies may need to meet multiple functional requirements, and these purposes must all be addressed during the development process. Regulators should also consider non-functional requirements. A non-functional requirement, sometimes also called a quality requirement, imposes a constraint on the system's design or implementation. For example, it may require that certain information is not allowed to be reported, or that certain information must be reported in a certain way, for example, with a positive rather than a negative sign. Moving on to the next slide, let's talk about use cases. The second step in defining requirements is to establish use cases, which represent a list of actions that define the interactions between users in the system to achieve a specific goal. Use cases describe the ways in which the data is represented and transported by XBRL are to be prepared or used. For example, A use case may be a preparer representing a table of financial information for a company. For a consumer, a use case would involve using that financial information in a data model to determine the solvency of that company. Well-defined use cases should capture all the possible ways that the user and a system can interact with each other that result in a user achieving his or her goal. Use cases define functional requirements, but can also define non-functional requirements. For example, if the consumer use case specifies that data must be strictly comparable, allowing extensions may not be appropriate because they reduce the ability to compare from entity to entity. Use cases can guide developers in understanding the system that they must represent within the XBRL taxonomy and must be thoroughly identified before development work can begin. The next step that we want to talk about on the next slide is how we analyze the data. This step towards defining requirements is to analyze the data. As use cases are identified and reviewed, regulators and developers should analyze the data for each use case, how it is currently prepared, transmitted, collected, and consumed. Regulators may analyze databases that are currently used to contain the data to determine how they are structured, to consider what they are lacking in the current database structure, and what standards might help resolve some of these deficiencies. Regulators should review the design of various forms and the instructions on those forms that are used today to collect the information from preparers. They can identify various data types. Are they monetary? Is it a string piece of data? Text blocks? Are there enumerated data types that can improve the consistency of what is being reported? They can also identify data that is reported as being potentially sensitive data. Once we've identified the data that we're looking to collect, let's identify the stakeholders. Stakeholders are entities with an interest in the project. It could be a single person, a group of people, or an entire organization. Stakeholders offer opinions, insight, and experience. No single stakeholder likely has the breadth of knowledge, perspective, or understanding to shape the entire taxonomy. Therefore, it's vitally important to engage all relevant parties during the development process. At least one stakeholder from each link on the data supply chain, the data preparation and consumption, for example, should be represented when determining the initial use cases for the taxonomy. Later, a broader survey of stakeholders and interested parties may be necessary to ensure that the taxonomy captures all possible situations. Once we've got our data and our stakeholders identified, we'd move on to identify the software and systems involved. Other technologies, applications, and systems are usually involved in the information supply chain. These may be systems for storing the data, analyzing or interpreting the data, sharing it, or simply receiving or collecting the data. The taxonomy will need to be compliant with the anticipated data formats, the transmission system itself, and with regulatory groups and agencies. We talked a little bit earlier about some of the formats, the XML, the JSON, the CSV. Those are all potential scenarios that how our data can be used. In addition to considering the systems involved in the transmission of data from preparers to consumers, data can originate from a wide range of systems and formats depending on the preparer's environments. If no formalized system exists, taxonomy developers should also consider what systems may be necessary to support the structured reporting process. Let's take some of these items and apply them to the FDIC reporting model. Today, approximately 5,000 banks report financial call data to the FDIC each quarter. They select from among 9 FDIC-approved software applications to create their reports. The data that they report is forms-based. It's well-structured. The FDIC makes the data available internally where it can be used by their own banking analysts and also publicly available to other consumers interested in the data. To move to the next slide and talk about some of the implications for the FDIC program. When building their program, the FDIC considered the many use cases that they had internally, conducted by their own bank analysts, in addition to the use cases by banks, other data users, and the software vendors that supported bank reporting. Because the FDIC was already working closely with existing call report software vendors, the vendors were part of the development team and worked to revise their applications to generate standardized call report data. Banks were able to use the same software applications that they had always used as these vendor tools connected to the taxonomy to determine what information to report and to fill in the various reports and schedules. This minimized the reports on banks' reporting functions. Because of the structured nature of the standardized data, they were able to incorporate error and data quality checks into the software so that banks could edit their data prior to submission. This improved the timeliness and the quality of the data and reduced the need for manual vetting by bank staff before submission. Because of the forms-based nature of this data reported, the FDIC implemented a closed reporting system that did not allow for extensions. Finally, the FDIC maintains and supports the taxonomy and have put in place a structure where the bank analysts can update and maintain the taxonomy themselves without the need for FDIC IT staff to get involved. This makes it much easier to change the reporting requirements quickly and efficiently. The FDIC publishes a new release of the taxonomy, often on a quarterly basis. Our next example is the SEC reporting model. The SEC requires about 6,000 plus public companies to submit XBRL formatted data each quarter. Historically, preparers have used lots of different tools and providers, from filing agents to law firms to in-house preparation using purchased software applications. The data is uploaded to the SEC's EDGAR online reporting system and made available as individual reports to various users. The financial statement data reported, as shown in the example from Darden Restaurants here on the screen, follows US GAAP accounting standards, but can also include non-GAAP, industry-specific measures. In fact, companies can also report custom-created line items, or in this example, they can use their own naming convention for the labels. Darden has assigned the label restaurant labor to the XBRL concept cost direct labor. The flexibility that allows companies to report this kind of data is considered critical for investors to understand the specifics of a company's financial health. Because of the variety of industries among public companies, there's a tremendous amount of flexibility in what companies can report using XBRL. Moving to the next slide, let's talk about some of the specific implications for the SEC program. The SEC financial data reported through XBRL and EDGAR has multiple users and multiple use cases. When establishing standards, the SEC had to consider their existing EDGAR collection system and a wide variety of preparation and consumption tools and providers. In addition, as mentioned earlier, the existing reporting requirements for public companies allowed for significant flexibility. This meant that the SEC allowed the base taxonomy to be extended. Although the SEC program allows for more flexibility in reporting, XBRL SEC data is widely used by investors and they are asking for more. Today, data providers like Morningstar, Refinitiv, formerly Thomson Reuters, CalcBench, Standard & Poor's, Bloomberg, and others rely on XBRL formatted data because it is faster and cheaper for them to process and because the data quality is good. It is vastly better than working with HTML or text data. Let's go back to Rob. Let's have a little discussion. And we've got a couple questions that we want to talk to here about how they went about defining the requirements in preparation for building their own taxonomy. And the first question I want to ask Rob is, what use cases did the FERC taxonomy address, and who are some of the key stakeholders?
Thanks, Joe. So we have, our use cases are very simple. We wanted to make sure we were still getting data from the filers in an easy way. And for our internal database and compliance officers, accountants, and program analysts to be able to access the data in a much easier model. So our stakeholders were mostly built upon internal FERC staff, and external filers. And we wanted to produce a way for the public to get at this data in the same way that they've done before. Historically, we've been making these filings into PDFs and saving them in our, what we call our e-library. It's our repository of records. So they've been PDFs in this library. We've made a very poorly designed DBF file available for those in the past. And we wanted to make the data cleaner, still continue to provide a human readable version of the file in e-library, while also allowing anybody to download the instance files, the valid instance files, the accepted instance files as they come into into the system, and provide an entire history of instance files, of filings for each filer to be able to look back through and reference to go through. So our stakeholders were pretty simple. We didn't concentrate very much more on other than how we would use the data is how we think the public uses the data.
Great. Now, Rob, I know you're the business guy and not the IT guy, but I got to ask you, what are some of the systems and software involved, and how does that change with standardization?
Yeah. So talking about the systems and software. So for a long time, FERC was in, these are the last Visual Fox Pro collected forms that the commission has. It was important for the commission to move away from providing software. We didn't want to continue to support any sort of version of the software that we would have to change that would live on a filer's computer that had problems with port access and things like that, which is what we've been discovering more and more with the later and later versions of Windows. And we've been getting a lot of complaints about those things. Also, it was just hard to do. So we got rid of thinking about software at all for the filers. And we're just providing, as we're talking about today, instructions, taxonomies, and all the code that we have. Internally, this is held in a SQL database, just like pretty much so many other types of in a data warehousing type model that the commission will have access to. As I said, we're making available the actual instance file that we're processing into our database available for the public for anybody else to process into whatever database they have. Internally, we've contracted with a couple of software vendors to be able to adjust the taxonomy at any time with obviously sufficient notice and input. And we did for the first time use a way for the public to comment directly onto the taxonomy. So we chose a program called Yeti, which is from a software company called Core Filing, to be able to show a graphic representation, a GUI, for a SharePoint essentially of the FERC taxonomies. And it's live right now. It's at xbrlview.ferc.gov. I think all the other agencies have the same type of URL, and we wanted to stick to that format. So anyone can go at any time to xbrlview.ferc.gov and take a look at our taxonomy. It's just one of the pieces of software we had to do so people could have a more deeper relationship with how we're coding, see the structure of it, and all the concepts.
Great. And I know everybody out there wants to know why. What are the benefits? How do you expect FERC to gain from implementing standards such as these?
Well, talking from the inside out, the less we have to clean data, the more that our data analysts can spend on analyzing the data. And that was an essential goal of the commission, was to make sure the data comes in the door valid, accurate, and easy to put into a table and easy to get to. And we have very high validation standards on this data, where in the past, speaking a little out of turn, but sometimes there weren't very high validations put on the Visual Fox Pro. So we're ensuring that balance sheets balance with XBRL, and that items are tagged correctly. You don't input a number more than once. It's just used several, the concept is defined once and it's just printed differently on different pages. So internally, our analysts and our accountants are looking forward to being able to rely exceptionally well on the data being accurate as soon as it's filed, and being able to reproduce in a visual format or pull in years worth of data to whatever program, accounting software, auditing software that we have internally. We plan to convert as best as possible 10 years of data going back starting in Q3 of 2021, and it should be up by the time we launch in Q3 of 2021. There may be that last quarter may take a little time to get in for the quarterlies. So on the external side, we're looking for, we think that filers over time, once they get these systems in place, will see a drastic reduction in cost and time of preparing this data to send to us. We relied on, in doing our rulemakings about this, we relied on several studies that have been put out about how over time SEC data has been easier to submit once companies got past the initial spend to understand whatever software they're getting to and possibly use these XBRL tags all the way through their internal software programs. And we see this as being an energy taxonomy for the country and maybe the world, for other places to adopt our concepts, maybe linked to our taxonomy and going forward. So we think that FERC is very pleased to be leading the way in developing these standards for the energy industry.
That's great. You mentioned some awesome benefits for FERC. What about some of your stakeholders? How about the utilities and the data users? What are some of the gains that they could expect to realize from your standardization?
Well, we expect there to be, there's a robust market that's going to take this data and do what they do with data. I mean, I heard an example a couple months ago on a call or an in-person thing when we had those, an in-person conference. We talked about how Pokemon Go uses data from NOAA, uses weather data from NOAA. We don't know how making this data standard will enable different markets to take advantage of it, but I can tell you that many of the investors are very interested in being able to see this data in a very easy way to digest, as opposed to flipping through pages and pages of a form that they would print out. Because it will be standard, you will be able to link to it in whatever database that they created from it. So utilities gain an easier way to submit this information, to comment on this information, and to certify that their information is accurate. There's been, in the utility sphere, there's been, over time, Visual Foxborough has lost its shine. And as great as it was in the beginning, there's so many more solutions that can be better for them to produce. So when we're putting the opportunity for a utility, an oil pipeline company or a large electric company to develop whatever software they want to submit this data, they can buy the Platinum standard where it reaches all the way down into their books, or they can buy probably some sort of web-based standard will also be available, we'd assume, at some point where they could still run the same model that they have with their frontline workers who manage these plants and have the operations data, and their financial regulatory accountants that has the accounting data, and all of them will have to work somehow together to put this information in, but that's left up to them to design, as opposed to coming in and dictating them all work from one program that we provide.
I guess I'd like to jump in just for a second and mention that you relied on a software technology at the time for many years to be the format to submit. And now essentially you're becoming software platform independent. And what you have then is the data in an open format that can both be used by preparers and consumers and by the government, right?
That's very true. Yeah, we dictated not only we're still dictating how the form will look if you print it out, but we took developing this system in the other direction, and we looked at the data points that we wanted to collect and then decided how it would look later. And we tried to match them as much as we could to the old thing. So yes, this is an open system. This is an open way for people to submit this information. They'll be able to, honestly, the sky's the limit on what they need to do, because it's all going to be, in separate places.
Sure.
For
The thing is, you're not tied to any particular software vendor.
Not at all.
And that's true. Same thing on the consumer side. And presumably when you're in a standard format, they have lots of different tools and options that they can use. We're kind of running up against a hard break at the end here, and we also have to do the CPE questions. And we have some questions that are coming from the audience here. Seeing how we were just talking about presenting stuff, one of the questions was, could you take a little bit of time to talk about presentations, how they're defined by the agency and the taxonomy? And I guess I'll start by addressing that. If you look at the SEC wanted to give maximum ability for the preparers to say how they wanted their data to present within a general XBRL viewer. That has moved now more to the inline XBRL side. Is it correct, Rob, in saying that basically the FERC doesn't care about presentations? They just want the instance data, but you are going to take that data and drive it into essentially an inline XBRL type of a presentation of the data then, right? You're going to take conventional XML and then dump it back out as a viewable HTML with the data embedded. That's
exactly right. We are going to, and we published our code to render that too. So that's all public. It's totally transparent. So if a vendor system decides to, takes that code, the filer can see exactly how the commission system will take it and put it into an HTML document in our e-library, also in our portal, which is at ecollection.ferc.gov, to then view or export as a PDF or print as a PDF, however they'd like. So the presentation is, as you said, it's inconsequential here.
Yeah.
It's the final thing of what we thought about is people want to see it in some way, so we tried to emulate how it was done in the past. I mean,
you have to bridge that gap between what is proper data modeling that's useful for analysis and then what is useful for human consumption. And I think that's one of the things actually that XBRL does reasonably well, because you have the opportunity to submit in a couple different formats and to be presentationless, which essentially is what FERC is when you're submitting. But once you have it, you can push it out. For the SEC in inline XBRL, the presentation is defined by the HTML document, as well as the data model representations, which you're probably not familiar with, but you still can go back to the conventional side and say, this is the presentation for the balance sheet, and actually go look at the data elements as opposed to having it filled with HTML. One question that came up, I mentioned before that GAP has 17,000 plus elements in it, maybe even 18,000. How many elements altogether or concepts are in the FERC taxonomy?
So altogether, we have 10,150 concepts. 2,000, about 2,500 are abstract. So there's about 7,600 elements that are not abstract. So some of them are just, section names and things like that. So we're smaller than the SEC, but
yeah. I would dive in just for people who aren't familiar. Abstracts are concepts that help organize things. They're essentially headings that would sit on line items, which were useful, but they don't really add anything to the data other than organization. Moving on then, one question is, I understand that FERC is considering using the LEI to identify legal entities, but chose to implement a proprietary identifier. Might this be a temporary measure and the LEI eventually adopted? I think that's a very wide question actually across the board for a lot of agencies.
Yeah, I can't commit to FERC adopting LEI at any time in the future. I think an identifier like the LEI is an excellent thing to have as a part of a filing. I know that our CIDs is our custom one that we've always had. It's not new. It's something that FERC has always had for each one of its customers. We had the infrastructure for our company registration system to continue to use it. And so we made use of that. That doesn't mean that at any time in the future, we can't turn on an LEI field in these filings as an optional field and then make it mandatory at some point. But FERC uses what's called a CID, a company identifier, and we're using that. At least we wanted to get things up in a very easy way as possible before branching into much further discussions about different types of identifiers and things.
Yeah, I think everybody's been wrestling with that for quite a long time. Certainly the SEC has, and they went with the central index key, or the CIK, which is an arbitrary thing. And of course, there's tax numbers and there's many other things, QSIPs and whatnot. So, I mean, the LEI is something that's been developing over the past couple of years, and we'll have to see where that ends up in the long run. There's a question that is whether or not we do a deeper dive into some of the more granular stuff. We're going to be doing additional presentations like this in the coming months. So I think that we'll be covering that in that particular case. I'm not sure, I guess here a question from one of the folks is, when will a voluntary submission be available?
So the system, the FERC's e-form system at ecollection.ferc.gov is live. Filers and vendors can prepare their filing and submit through that system once they get a company identifier. And vendors, there's a process on ferc.gov's website to just send a simple email and talk to our CID team to get a identifier. And it's in a test only phase right now. There won't be voluntary submissions that will count as a submission. We won't be implementing that because of the transfer of data. We want to have a very clean movement of the old data into the new system. So we're still going to stick to Q3 of 2021 when submissions will start adding to the official database. But right now the system is live and will send out email notifications about having received one. It will check filings and validate, and just won't add anything to our repository of record or our database.
I'll do one last one here, and we'll go to the CPE because we are over the end of the hour. Given the relatively large amount of data elements and the likely tie-in with other types of data, e.g. the impact on weather and energy, wouldn't the possibility of using graph databases semantically linked to triple stores, not sure what that means, be worth looking into? And I think that's a very wide question for analytics. I don't know if you can see that question, Rob, on this question.
I can see it. I'm reviewing it again. I'm trying to make sure that I understand. Given the relatively large amount of data, I am not the most technical person. I've ushered this project to the end, so I would have to learn about graph databases to be able to answer that question, to understand. But I can tell you that we are open to looking into anything that makes this information easy to digest and understand, or link to other systems. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, that's fine. I think that's. If you go and look at what some of the people have done over the years with SEC data, you'll find some amazing stuff, including net type things and graph, different types of graphs and whatnot. What XBRL does is I think it's going to allow a lot more flexibility for people to do analysis that no one ever thought of before. As this data becomes, more and more data becomes public and available for people to do analysis. So it's almost 5 after. Why don't we go ahead and move on to the CPE questions? If that sound good, Michelle?
Sure. And Joe, I don't know if you want to do just a quick wrap up after your.
Sure. I just want to thank Rob and Scott for being on today as well. As I was going through this, the things that I look for in a taxonomy and designing a data model are comprehensive, flexible, and meet the needs of the stakeholders. And I think what we heard from Rob today is that they've got something at the FERC that meets that. And then I think that those are kind of a couple of the guiding factors that we'd want to look at. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Michelle.
Great, thank you. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And I know, I'm sorry, we're running a little bit late. I want to make sure we get through the CPE questions, but So let me just run through those, and I'll open up our next poll number 3. Okay, so which of the following regulators opted for an open taxonomy, where reporting entities are allowed to create entity-specific custom concepts? The SEC, the FDIC, or the FERC? An open taxonomy, where custom contacts are allowed.
And I hate to talk over the CPE questions, but one thing we did mention was elements versus concepts, and they're the same thing. That's an XBRL or XML holdover.
Just like another 15 seconds and we'll go to the final CPE question. Okay, I'm going to close down this poll. All right, go to our last CPE question. Which of the following approaches does the SEC not use to make public company data available to the public? Through RSS feeds of company filings available as soon as posted on EDGAR, through SEC provided analytical applications for querying and extraction, through company filings that can be downloaded from the SEC EDGAR system, or through historical bulk data downloads. Which one do they not use? Just another 30 seconds here. Okay, we're going to be closing the poll. Okay, I'm closing it right now. Okay, well, thank you very much. The answer to that question was the SEC does not make available analytical applications. I mean, much like what Rob was explaining a little bit earlier, there's no need to, because the data is already in machine readable form and there are lots of tools out there that can access the data. So with that, I'm just going to go to our last slide, which talks about some upcoming programs. The next event that we have is our investor forum. It's November 17th through 18th. And this is going to be an online forum. There are 2 half days. They're going to be keynoted by SEC Commissioner Allison Heron-Lee on day 1. And on day 2, we're going to have PwC Vice Chair Wes Bricker, who also happens to be the chairman of the XBRL International Board of Directors. So we hope that all of you will come to that. This is also a free event. And then in early December, we will have the next in our Taxonomy Development Handbook webinar series. And this one is going to cover something a little bit different. It's going to be speaking to SASB data standards. SASB is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. They have developed ESG standards for sustainability, and they are putting those into an XBRL taxonomy. So we're going to be talking a little bit with the SASB. We'll also be showing that taxonomy that's in development. And we're actually going to be showing some XBRL reports that are based on it, and also show how they'll be able to be consumed. So that should be a really interesting one, maybe a little bit longer than the typical ones that we've been doing. But I hope that you join us for both of these events. And again, I want to thank Joe Lechka. Joe has been involved in XBRL since as long as I've been involved in XBRL too, with KPMG. Rob Hudson, who we're very excited to begin working with Rob and the FERC on their new initiative. And Scott Tice, who is our leader on the Domain Steering Committee and who really helps us drive a lot of these programs. So